Beginning C# 12, you can place any parameters followed by the class or struct name. These are called primary constructors. Let's see what primary constructors have to offer us, how to use them, and some of the things to keep in mind when using them. Hello everyone, my name is Rahul and welcome back to another video in my C# series. If you're new here, I make videos on .NET, Cloud, and DevOps. Primary constructors is a concise syntax to declare constructors whose parameters are available anywhere in the body of that type. Since these are available throughout the body of the type, these can be used to initialize properties or fields, variables in methods or local functions, pass parameters to base constructor in the case of inheritance, etc. Before we go any further, let's see a primary constructor in action to understand this better. So here I have linkpad, which is a scratchpad for writing .NET code. Here I have a simple person class which has the properties name and age. And this has a normal constructor which takes in the name and the age and assigns them to these properties. With primary constructors, you can define this constructor along with your type definition, which means I can simply specify it right alongside with my type name, that is person, and specify that this takes in a string name and also an int age. Now, as soon as you return this constructor is now throwing an error. So we can safely remove this. So let's comment this out. And in this case, we can assign the name and the age to these properties directly. Now you're getting the warnings that the parameter name is unread. So in this case, let's go and assign this to our name property. Similarly, we can also assign the age to the age property. Now we have successfully defined a primary constructor in this case. So this is nothing but the constructor which is defined along with our type name with the parameters that's required for that. Now if you want to create an instance of this, so we can create a new person and pass in the parameters as usual. So in this case, let's specify Rahul Nath and let's specify the age as 30 and we have created a new person. Let's see the underlying code that is generated for this person class. So let's disassemble this code using ILSpy, which is a feature that linkpad provides. So I'm opening up ILSpy for this particular type using a shortcut for linkpad. You can also go to the query and open it using reflect query in ILSpy. So let's navigate to the person type and you can see the automatically generated code. Now let's expand this constructor and you can see that this is very much looking like a code that we had manually written before with the name and the age on the constructor that we had defined. So the compiler has automatically created this code for us. Since these parameters are available anywhere inside this type definition, we can use them inside functions as well. So let's see an example of that. So let's write in a new function in here. So let's specify public void display info and let's open and close the brackets. And in this case, let's simply write a console.writeLine statement and write the person's information into the console. So let's specify name and let's use string interpolation. Use the name property that's coming from the primary constructor. So let's simply specify name and let's also specify the age. Note here, I'm using the smaller cased name and the age, which refers to these primary constructors coming up through the constructor and not the properties that we have set. So in this case, we're directly using the parameters from our function code since that's available throughout the type declaration. Now, as soon as I used the name property within this console statement, you can see that the compiler is generating a warning saying that the parameter string name is captured into the state of this enclosing type and is also used to initialize a field, property, or event. This is because this particular thing is used to assign this property and also used elsewhere. So this is generally not recommended, which is why there is a warning. We will go into the details more about this later in this video. So let's see if this is functioning as expected. So let's use the person and let's display the information. So let's specify the display info and let's simply run this application. So now in this case, you can see that this is outputting the values name and age to the console. Now, since the parameters are available anywhere inside this type information, this makes it useful to inject dependencies in your classes. Now, if you're new to dependency injection in .NET, I highly recommend checking out my video, which will be linked here and in the descriptions below. So let's go outside of our person class and let me paste in some code. So here I have a person controller class and I also have a person repository. Now this is simply simulating a controller which uses a repository to get the data. Now in this case, in the getPerson call, I need to call the person repository.getPerson and return that information. So let's add in the new constructor to inject in the iPerson repository. Now the usual way would be to create a new constructor here, inject in the iPerson repository and assign it to a field and use it within the application. But with primary constructors, you can directly inject the type inside the type name itself. So right after the person controller, you can specify iPerson repository and take in the repository in here. Now, since this is available throughout the type name, we can simply use it inside our function, which means I can specify return repository getPerson and pass in the ID and return that data. Now, this makes it extremely easy to inject in the type and use it in here within the function. If you have other methods, you can use it inside that as well. But generally, I don't prefer using this style of using the primary constructors for dependency injection. Before we go into the details of why I don't usually prefer this method, let's see what it means to have additional constructors when you have a primary constructor on your type. If you've been enjoying the video so far, please don't forget to hit that like button. And while you're down there, also hit that subscribe button. It helps me to grow this YouTube channel and also lets you know when I post a next video. Primary constructors indicates that those parameters are necessary for any instance of that type, which means you cannot avoid specifying that parameters since that could be used anywhere within that type. So it's mandatory to specify those values. So when we have other constructors, when you already have a primary constructor, every other constructor for that class must call the primary constructor. Now this could be directly calling it or via another constructor which in turn calls the primary constructor. In the end, all that matters is those two properties are explicitly getting set using the primary constructor. So let's see what this means in action. So let's come back to our person class. Now inside here we have one primary constructor. So let's create a new constructor. So let's use the CTOR and tab, and this creates a new constructor for us. Now you can already see the red squiggly line, which is an error, which says a constructor declared in a type with parameter list must have this constructor initializer, which means I need to call the other constructor, which is a primary constructor in this case. So let's specify this and pass in the values. So let's specify default and let's also specify the age as 0. So in this case, we are passing in the default parameters for this particular person. So let's create a new default person and let's simply use that new constructor that we have created without passing in any parameters. Now you can see this works as expected. So let's use the default person and let's display that info in here and run this to see this in action. This writes out the default and the age as 0. Now, if you have more constructors inside this, so let's say we have a constructor that just takes in a name. So let's specify string name. In this case, this still throws an error and says this you should be calling the this constructor. So in this case, I can pass the this and pass just the name and pass the age as 0, specifying a default value. Now you can see in this case, both our constructors are explicitly calling the primary constructors and making sure that the two values are getting set. Now this particular constructor can also be calling this other constructor which takes in the one parameter. So instead of calling the primary constructor here, we can just make a call to this other constructor which just takes in the name. But note that in this case, this constructor is calling this one, which in turn is calling the primary constructor. The only thing that's getting made sure here is that this property name and age is always getting set. Primary constructor parameters are mutable. This is one of the things that you need to keep in mind when using primary constructors, and also one of the reasons that I don't prefer using this in a lot of use cases. Being mutable means you can change the values of these parameters anywhere inside your type code. So let's see what it means that these parameters are mutable. So let's navigate into our person class again. So inside our display info method, let's create another display info uppercase. So let's copy and paste this method and let's say display info uppercase. So let's assume that someone implementing this method used the name is equal to name dot to upper to make this as uppercase and write it inside the console. Now this works perfectly fine when looking at display info uppercase. So let's make a call to display info uppercase. So let's use the new method. So let's specify person dot display info uppercase. Now this is going to work exactly as we expected, and it is going to write this as uppercase. Now what if we decide to display the info again for the person? So let's say display info again on this particular person. Now in this case, you can see that the person's property is getting updated and it's getting uppercase everywhere else that we are going to use it. This is because the function display info uppercase mutated the value of the name and assigned this property to be uppercase, which means anyone using after that, it's going to use the value uppercase. Let's see how the constructor code for this is getting generated. So let's open the ILSpy and let's see the person class in there. So let's navigate to the person and let's look at the code that is getting generated. Here we can see we have the previous constructors as before, and it's also having the new constructors that we wrote. But we also have an automatically generated property which is compiler generated and it is not visible otherwise. So we have the name and the age properties inside here. So these are simply private string fields inside our person class. This is what is making it available to these display info and also display info uppercase methods. Now, since these are just private fields, you can override these values, which means anyone who is overriding inside these function changes that for this class instance. This is the same reason why I don't prefer using this when using for dependency injection. So if I was to come back to our person controller, let's say we have another method inside this. Now in this case, you could have the appropriate code that is required to delete, and someone could also make the repository as null inside this after they make the delete. So you could affect the parameters that's getting passed in and override it with undesired values. This leaves the whole object instance in an invalid state. Now if someone was to use the same instance to get a person again, the repository will throw a null reference exception and it will throw an error to the end user. Now these are undesired effects when you write code. My preferences of using the primary constructor is to use this to set the property fields. So in this case, let's simply specify a read-only property. So let's specify read-only and let's specify the iPerson repository, and in this case, name this as repository. Now we can assign the repository value coming from the primary constructor directly in here. So let's specify repository and then set this value. Now you can see that this is immediately throwing that warning. So using this as a guideline, let's go and replace the get person to use the repository that we have set, which is from the read only. So you wouldn't be using the repository anywhere else inside your application code. So let's remove that so that this warning disappears. You can also go and enable this warning to be treated as an error. If you don't know how to do that when building .NET applications, let me know in the comments below and I'll show you how to do that in a different video. Primary constructors are also a great way to initialize the properties when you have data transfer objects. So let's specify you have a public class person DTO. And all we have is to create two properties. So in this case, we have two properties. And instead of having to create a constructor inside this explicitly and passing in the values, you can simply remove this and use primary constructors. So you can specify string name and the int age and assign these values inside this. But if you're using this for DTOs, you might as well make this as a record type and simply avoid having to write any of these and simply use the properties name and age inside the primary constructor directly, because record types does allow you that. Now, if you're completely new to record types, I highly recommend checking out that video, which will be linked here and in the descriptions below. Thank you and see you soon in that video.